During the bitter winter of 1887, as howling northern gales swept down from the Sangre de Cristo Range onto the New Mexican plains, most households in the Santa Rosa Valley were forced to make an agonizing choice. Remaining meant watching their own children starve to death. Leaving meant walking away from every single thing they had built with their sweat. Yet one particular woman, a 32-year-old Mexican widow named Marta Solís, never had to face that dilemma. While the surrounding folks prayed for divine intervention, she simply sat by her hearth, watching strips of venison slowly cure in the warm draft of her cabin, keeping her 3 little ones well fed with supplies she had laid up months in advance. Those exact same men who had previously mocked the trenches she made in the dirt, claiming she was out of her mind for burrowing like a wild beast, were now knocking at her threshold, hats in hand, begging to be taught her methods. However, to truly grasp how a penniless, husbandless, and utterly disrespected woman accomplished what the wealthiest ranchers in the county failed to do, we must rewind the clock a year and a half. We need to go back to the very day Marta pulled into the valley, carrying every last worldly possession she owned in a rickety wagon hauled by a pair of exhausted mules. It was the springtime of 1886 when Marta Solís forded the Pecos River alongside her 3 kids. Her eldest boy, Diego, was barely 9 years of age. The youngest girl, Luz, was still a nursing infant. Rafael, her husband, had passed away half a year prior after his mount bucked him headfirst into a boulder along the trail to Las Vegas. There was absolutely no margin for elaborate mourning. She had hungry mouths to provide for, and a looming winter ticking down like a clock that no human could pause. The parcel of property she managed to acquire with her final few dollars sat on the absolute fringes of the valley, a place where the soil was unforgiving and water was hard to come by. 30 acres of absolute nothingness. Whenever the locals rode past in their buggies, they stared at her with a blend of pity and sheer bewilderment. A solitary female with 3 youngsters wouldn't last a single season out there, they gossiped. This territory had already watched countless widows pack up and head back south, completely broken by the harsh northern landscape. Yet what these folks failed to realize was that Marta Solís was cut from a different cloth compared to the other ladies around those parts. She was raised up in the mountain village of Chimayo, a place where her paternal grandfather, a fellow by the name of Teodoro Solís, had absorbed ancient Pueblo Indian wisdom that the Spanish settlers stubbornly refused to comprehend. These were deep secrets regarding how the very dirt beneath your feet could become your greatest ally, provided you simply learned how to listen to it. One particular evening, just a few weeks following her arrival, Marta found herself sitting outside her modest adobe cabin, gazing up at the starlit sky while her little ones slumbered. Anxiety weighed heavily upon her chest, heavy as a boulder. She was down to her last $11, $11 to survive the entire freezing season. Mr. William Garrett, the most prosperous cattle baron in the entire county, had rolled by earlier that afternoon, hauling a wagon loaded down with supplies. He had sacks of milled flour, large barrels packed with salted beef, and glass jars full of lard. He had offered a brief wave of his hand, but he certainly didn't bother to stop. After all, why on earth would he? To him, she was an absolute nobody. Right then and there, staring deeply into the fading embers of her tiny campfire, Marta suddenly recalled something. A vivid memory from her early childhood came rushing back. She must have been around 7 years of age at the time. Her grandfather Teodoro had guided her to the outskirts of Chimayo, right to the lands cultivated by the native tribes. Out there, he had pointed out a rather peculiar sight to her. She saw elongated trenches scooped out of the ground, measuring roughly 3 feet deep and stretching nearly 10 feet in length. A very small blaze burned at one end, while thick smoke billowed out from the opposite side. Suspended right above that draft of smoke were strips of elk meat, swaying gently whenever the breeze caught them. Her grandpa had clarified that the ancient ones never required massive wooden smokehouses. The soil itself essentially functioned as their curing chamber. Heat would slowly creep up through the buried tunnel, allowing the smoke to chill and thicken, creating the perfect environment to dry the meat without actually roasting it. Best of all, it barely consumed any firewood whatsoever. That very night, Marta made up her mind. Come daybreak, she was going to start digging. By the time the sun crested the horizon, she was already hard at it. She picked out a spot situated on the slope of a modest hillside, ensuring proper drainage so the ground wouldn't flood. Wielding a battered shovel she had hauled all the way from Chimayo, she began to break ground. New Mexican soil is incredibly unforgiving. It feels as hard as solid iron in certain patches, and it's choked with heavy rocks in others. Her palms, though already toughened by daily chores, were bleeding long before the noon hour hit. Her eldest boy, Diego, stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. "Mama, what exactly are you making?" he inquired. Pausing for a second, Marta wiped the perspiration from her brow and flashed a gentle smile. "I'm building a magical oven, my boy. An oven that operates without forcing us to spend what we simply don't possess." Yet, the valley was far from deserted, and gossip travels at lightning speed in tightly knit settlements. By the third morning, she already had folks dropping by. The first to arrive was Thomas McAllister, a Scotsman who had settled there a decade and a half prior and currently ran the town's general store. He was a massive fellow, sporting a fiery red beard and hands the size of cured hams. Dismounting his steed, he ambled over to the spot where Marta was shoveling dirt. He eyed the lengthy, narrow trench, which was barely 18 inches across, but already a solid 3 feet deep. A look of absolute bewilderment washed over his face. "Mrs. Solís, pardon my intrusion, but what in tarnation are you up to? Looks like you're digging a grave." Marta didn't pause her labor for a second. "I am hollowing out a smokehouse, Mr. McAllister." The Scotsman blinked in surprise. "A smokehouse? Ma'am, a smokehouse is a wooden outbuilding rigged with iron hooks and a highly regulated hearth. What you've got here, with all due respect, is just a hole in the ground." Marta drove the spade firmly into the soil and stood up straight. She locked her gaze right onto the man's eyes. "Tell me, Mr. McAllister, what is the going rate at your store to put up a wooden smokehouse?" The big man scratched his bearded chin. "Well, between the lumber, the iron nails, a hinged door, plus the labor if you ain't handy with carpentry, I'd reckon about $60. Make it 70 if you want the thing to hold up over time." Marta gave a slight nod. "I happen to have exactly $11 to get my family through the frost. This here hole, as you so call it, will cost me absolutely 0 cents and will accomplish the exact same task, probably even better." McAllister stared back at her with a mixture of quiet awe and deep sympathy. "Ma'am, I have watched plenty of homesteaders attempt bizarre schemes out in this valley. The vast majority of them are either 6 feet under or long gone. Please be sensible." His tone lacked any malice, yet it carried the heavy burden of a man who had witnessed far too much suffering. Her second guest proved to be even worse. Father Cornelius Dunn, the Irish clergyman from the Santa Rosa Mission, showed up on day 4. He was a remarkably pale, bony fellow, possessing slate-gray eyes that seemed to critically judge every single thing they rested upon. Accompanying him were 2 female parishioners, Sisters Lucinda and Beatrice Hoffman, whose father was a wealthy Albuquerque banker who had bought up local acreage. Father Dunn inspected the excavation, which now measured close to 6 feet deep and 16 feet long, winding ever so slightly like a sluggish serpent. Marta had just initiated a secondary perpendicular shaft designed to generate a draft. "Mrs. Solís," the priest murmured in a quiet yet unyielding tone, "I find myself deeply troubled regarding the state of your soul. The local ladies have informed me that you spend your entire days out here, scooping dirt as though driven by some demonic force. Your youngsters are running around without shoes while you partake in, forgive my bluntness, behavior no sane man would ever attempt. A flush of heat crept up the back of Marta's neck. It wasn't blind fury, but rather pure humiliation. It was the indignity of being evaluated by men who had never once experienced true starvation. Father, respectfully speaking, my children have a meal every single day. They are in good health, and this labor I am undertaking is far from madness. It's raw survival. The older of the two sisters, Beatrice Hoffman, stepped forward, holding a wicker basket. We have brought a loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese. We figured you might be in need of some assistance. Her tone was absolutely dripping with condescension, as though she were addressing a crippled stray dog. Marta accepted the goods simply because she wasn't a fool. Personal pride does not put food in a child's belly. I appreciate it, Miss Hoffman. However, I am not looking for handouts. I just need folks to let me do my chores in peace. Father Dunn let out a heavy sigh. We shall keep you in our prayers, my child, and it is my hope that once the frost settles in, and this little endeavor of yours fails, you will muster the humility to beg for rescue. They departed, leaving behind a trail of kicked-up dust and harsh judgment. Marta went right back to her digging. Her hands were shaking, not from terror, but from bitterly suppressed rage. But anger can be an incredibly useful tool. Rage provides the strength to heave a shovel. The third individual to drop by proved to be the absolute worst of the bunch. William Garrett, the affluent cattleman, rode up roughly a week later, perched upon a majestic black stallion, sporting a saddle worth far more than all of Marta's earthly possessions combined. He was a towering figure, hovering around 50, flaunting a waxed mustache and the distinct aura of a man fully accustomed to blind obedience. He remained securely in his saddle, peering downward at her. The man didn't even bother to dismount. Mrs. Solís, I've caught wind of some rather bizarre rumors concerning your activities. Folks claim you're out here scratching holes in the dirt like a wild Indian. Word is, you actually believe you can cure meat without a proper smokehouse. Marta held her tongue for a moment. She was busy lining the belly of her trench with flat river stones to forge a sturdy foundation. At last, she addressed him without even glancing up. Mr. Garrett, I don't merely believe I can. I am absolutely certain of it. My granddaddy passed this knowledge down to me. Garrett let out a barren, humorless chuckle. Your granddaddy. Ma'am, your grandpa most likely dwelled in a mud shack scraping by on beans and probably passed away completely broke. Meanwhile, I own 3 solid oak smoking sheds, complete with tin roofing and perfectly sealed heavy doors. I can process 100 pounds of beef in just 7 days. What you've got is a muddy pit that's bound to flood the minute we get a decent rainstorm. At long last, Marta locked eyes with him. Her gaze remained perfectly composed. Mr. Garrett, what was the total price tag for those 3 sheds of yours? The question clearly caught the wealthy rancher off guard. That is none of your concern. Of course it isn't. But I'd wager it ran you well over $200. Not to mention the sheer volume of cordwood you burn through keeping them going. I spent exactly 11 cents on this second-hand spade, and the total timber I'll consume this entire winter wouldn't even fill up that wagon of yours. Garrett glared back at her with a fleeting glimmer of what might have been genuine respect, though it vanished quickly. We shall see how things pan out once the freezing weather hits, lady. We'll see if your stubborn pride is enough to keep your bones warm. He spurred his horse into a gallop, abandoning her amidst a swirl of kicked-up dirt. Later that evening, Marta shed tears for the very first time since her husband's passing. It wasn't out of sorrow, but rather out of sheer physical exhaustion. Her palms were an agonizing mess of burst blisters. Her lower spine was a tight knot of relentless agony. But when little Diego asked if she was planning to quit digging, she simply shook her head. No, my sweet boy. When every single person insists you cannot do a thing, it simply means you possess a quality they lack entirely. And that realization terrifies them to the core. If you happen to believe that ancient wisdom holds far more value than modern arrogance, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to salvaging the very tales that history has attempted to erase. The grueling labor carried on. Day after day, Marta scooped dirt, while every single night her children drifted off to the rhythmic thud of the spade hitting the soil. By the tail end of June, her primary trench measured roughly 23 feet in length, over 3 feet wide, and about 4 feet deep. She had carved it out at a very slight upward slope, perhaps a 5-degree angle, to ensure the smoke would rise on its own accord. Down at the lowest point, she had fashioned a compact stone firebox where the embers would glow. Down at the opposite end, some 23 feet away, she had erected a mud brick chimney standing barely 12 inches above the ground. Next came the truly tricky phase of the project. Marta had to properly seal off the underground shaft. She mentally recalled her grandfather's exact advice. "The magic isn't in the flames, little Marta. The real trick lies in mastering the airflow. Should the draft rush through too swiftly, the blaze will simply scorch the meat. Should it creep along too sluggishly, your coals will snuff right out. You must locate that perfect, delicate balance." She gathered willow branches, the most pliable saplings she could forage alongside the riverbank, and wove them right over the trench to form a vaulted ceiling. Atop this wooden lattice, she piled layers of parched prairie grass, followed by a heavy coating of wet mud blended with straw. Her fingers, which now resembled those of an elderly laborer, worked the damp clay, forcefully packing it into every single crevice. The task took on a deeply soothing, meditative rhythm. The blazing July sunshine was absolutely punishing, yet she barely noticed the heat. Her mind was miles away, transported to a different era entirely, assisting her granddad beneath the towering pines of Chimayo. Diego pitched in by hauling heavy water pails straight from the nearby creek. The youngster was only 9, but he toiled with the endurance of a 20-year-old farmhand. He never uttered a single grievance. Not once did he bother to ask when they would finally be finished. Marta sensed that her boy grasped the massive stakes of their situation in a way the wealthy ranchers of the valley never possibly could. Right around mid-July, the earthen smoker was entirely finished. Viewed from the surface, the structure was virtually camouflaged. All you could spot was a prolonged mound of dirt, resembling an oversized grave, featuring a tiny rock threshold at the bottom and a squat chimney stack at the top. Marta rigged up a basic wooden hatch for the opening, utilizing some weathered planks she had scavenged from a deserted homestead roughly 2 miles up the road. On the very first day of August, she ran her initial test. She positioned a few chunks of bone-dry mesquite timber into the firebox, no more than 2 or 3 modest pieces. Striking a spark to the tinder, she sat back and waited. For a brief spell, absolutely nothing occurred. Then, at a sluggish pace, much like a slumbering beast drawing breath, a plume began to drift from the stack at the far side. It was a wispy, near-white vapor, carrying the sweet, fragrant scent of desert wood. Marta reached her palm right over the exhaust opening. The draft felt mildly warm to the touch, not scorching hot. Absolute perfection. Diego let out a loud whoop of pure joy. "It's working, Mama. It actually works." Later that exact evening, Marta brought down her very first deer. She had never been much of a hunter, but sheer desperation is an excellent tutor. Having witnessed the local outdoorsman tracking game, she had picked up the basics simply by watching closely. She relied on Raphael's battered rifle, an old Springfield model that had certainly endured far better times. Her prize was a young buck, weighing in at roughly 130 pounds. Hauling the carcass all the way back to her property, she methodically skinned the beast and sliced the flesh into slender strips, exactly the way her grandfather had demonstrated long ago. She suspended the raw cuts from wire hooks spaced evenly throughout the entire length of the buried tunnel. Next, she kindled the mesquite branches and settled in to wait. Billows soon choked the passageway, completely smothering the venison in a thick, ashen embrace. She could easily detect the scent of the chemical change taking root. That distinct mesquite aroma was merging perfectly with the metallic tang of raw flesh, forging an entirely new profile, something designed to withstand the test of time. At 6-hour intervals, Marta would toss in a tiny handful of fresh kindling. Nothing excessive, purely enough to ensure the vapor kept drafting upward. She figured out that tossing in green cottonwood twigs would generate an abundance of smog without spiking the temperature. She also realized that partially capping the exhaust pipe with a flat rock forced the haze to linger longer, allowing it to soak much deeper into the fibers. Exactly 2 full days later, she retrieved her very first sample cut. The strip was incredibly dark, bordering on pitch black, and felt just as stiff as tanned saddle leather. Yet the second she took a bite, an explosion of flavor washed over her palate. It was powerfully bold, deeply charred, and wonderfully rich. And above all else, all the moisture had been successfully drawn out. This jerky would keep for months on end, potentially surviving the entire freeze if she stowed it away properly. Diego nibbled on a chunk, his eyes flying wide open in shock. "Mama, this tastes 100 times better than the dried goods they sell at Mr. McAllister's." Marta beamed with pride. "And it barely cost us more than a handful of twigs, my sweet boy. While those fancy folks are burning through crisp dollar bills trying to keep their curing houses hot, we simply borrow the Earth's natural chill." All through August and September, Marta processed absolutely every scrap of meat she could either hunt down or purchase for pennies. That included deer, wild rabbits, and even a feral hog that Diego stumbled upon dead alongside the riverbank. Not a single morsel went to waste. She strictly adhered to her grandpa's techniques, the very same methods that the native tribes had been refining over centuries, and the system worked flawlessly. However, the neighboring folks were keeping a close eye on her, and the community gossiped constantly. Down at Mr. McAllister's Mercantile, the local men would gather every Saturday just to swap rumors. William Garrett was present, per usual, loading up on wholesale goods for his massive estate. "That Mexican gal is still out there playing in the mud," one fellow remarked. "Looks to me like she's attempting to cure some jerky." Garrett scoffed loudly. "Mud jerky is more like it. I bet the stuff is crawling with maggots and caked in absolute filth. I wouldn't let that garbage pass my lips, even if somebody handed me a fistful of cash." Yet not everyone shared that vicious mindset. Mr. McAllister, a man who had survived his fair share of trials out on the frontier, kept his mouth firmly shut. He had actually ridden past Marta's property roughly a week prior in the early dawn hours, well before she realized she had an audience. He had personally witnessed the hazy draft rising from her stubby smokestack and had inhaled the rich scent of burning mesquite. Most importantly, he had caught a glimpse of those hanging meat strips the moment she cracked open the wooden hatch to check on her batch. They looked incredibly appetizing, far too high quality to be the product of a mere dirt pit. Autumn eventually rolled in, painting the landscape in vibrant golden hues. The quaking aspen leaves up in the high country shifted to a shade resembling tarnished gold. The evening air steadily took on a sharp, biting chill. The ranchers across the valley initiated their seasonal slaughter to stock up for the deep freeze. Mr. Garrett butchered 5 head of cattle and spent a solid 7 days keeping his massive curing sheds blazing hot. His operation burned through 3 entire wagon loads of cordwood. Over at the general store, Thomas McAllister peddled a record number of iron nails, lumber, and repair tools to folks fixing up smokehouses that had rotted out over the summer months. Meanwhile, Marta quietly kept operating her subterranean tunnel. She had stumbled upon a secret her grandpa never bothered to mention, a trick she figured out entirely on her own. By experimenting with distinct varieties of timber, she could actually alter the flavor profiles of her jerky. Mesquite logs imparted a heavy, pleasantly sweet tang. Cottonwood branches offered a far milder, almost fragile taste. And juniper wood, highly abundant up in the foothills, delivered a sharp, piney kick that paired beautifully with pork. Late one afternoon toward the end of October, a rather surprising event unfolded. Lucinda Hoffman, one of the two siblings who had accompanied Father Dunn earlier, came strolling down the dirt road. She was traveling completely by herself, which was highly unusual. Ladies from wealthy backgrounds simply did not wander the trails unescorted. She paused just a few yards away from where Marta was busy with her chores. "Mrs. Solís," the girl called out with a distinct quiver in her voice. "Please forgive me for dropping by unannounced." Marta wiped her dusty palms on her apron. "It is no trouble at all, Miss Hoffman. How might I be of assistance to you?" The young woman, who couldn't have been more than 22 years of age, felt her cheeks flush. "It is terribly embarrassing, to be completely honest, but my sister and I have been attempting to cure beef in the smokehouse our father had erected. It is a truly beautiful structure, built entirely of cedar timber and fitted with solid brass hinges. Yet the meat turns out awful every single time. It either ends up scorched to a crisp or unpleasantly mushy. And we have burned through so much cordwood that my father is absolutely livid." Marta simply waited. She had long ago figured out that quiet moments often speak louder than any spoken sentence. Lucinda pushed forward. "I have caught the scent of your jerky. Whenever the breeze drafts from the east, that aroma drifts all the way to our property. It smells, and please pardon my saying so, far better than anything we have managed to produce. My sister insists it is utterly impossible, claiming you possess nothing but a hole in the dirt. But as for me, I simply had to witness it with my own two eyes." Marta gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You wish to inspect my curing tunnel, if you please. I won't breathe a word to a living soul if you prefer it kept secret. I am well aware that we mocked you. I know we behaved cruelly, but I am genuinely terrified that my kin might face starvation this winter, merely because we are too prideful to ask for instruction." A sudden shift occurred deep within Marta's chest. Perhaps it was sheer pity, or maybe it was the haunting memory of her very own desperation. "Step right this way," she replied. "I will give you a look." She pulled back the wooden hatch, sealing her subterranean smoker. A lazy cloud of vapor drifted out into the crisp air. Hung from wire hooks inside the cavern were dozens of meat strips in various phases of the drying process. A handful were still vivid red, having just been strung up. Others had turned a rich, dark hue and felt perfectly stiff, completely ready for the pantry. The fragrance was downright intoxicating. Lucinda brought a trembling hand up to cover her mouth. "Good heavens! It is absolutely brilliant. However did you manage this?" Marta broke down the entire system for her. She detailed the elongated trench designed to chill the smoke long before it ever brushed against the cuts. She explained the slight incline that coaxed the draft to flow on its own accord. She stressed the critical need to burn minimal kindling and keep the coals burning low. She shared the trick of utilizing distinct timber varieties to achieve different flavor profiles. And above all else, she emphasized the value of steady patience. You simply cannot rush the curing cycle. The vapor requires ample time to perform its earthy magic. Lucinda absorbed every single word, nodding continuously. By the time Marta wrapped up her explanation, tears were welling up in the younger woman's eyes. "You possess far more wisdom than every man in this valley combined, Mrs. Solís. And we acted with such malice. I am truly sorry." Marta gently patted the girl's forearm. "Let bygones be bygones. The only thing that truly matters is ensuring your siblings have full bellies when the frost sets in. That is the sole priority now." Lucinda departed, carrying a thick slab of dried venison wrapped snugly in a fresh cotton cloth. Marta never found out whether the girl actually told her family about the secret meeting. However, roughly a fortnight later, While walking past the Hoffman estate, she spotted them digging out a spot right next to their fancy cedar shed, something that bore a striking resemblance to an elongated trench. November rolled into the territory, carrying a biting chill. The initial frosts snuffed out whatever wildflowers still clung to life across the plains. Herds of wildlife steadily migrated down toward the lower elevations, seeking out patches of surviving green grass. Marta had already stockpiled well over 100 pounds of cured jerky inside her cramped mud brick cabin. She had bundled the provisions in heavy cotton fabric and suspended them from the rafters, keeping them safely out of reach from scavenging mice. Combining that meat with a few burlap sacks of pinto beans and corn she had purchased with her final pennies, she could easily sustain her youngsters straight through to the spring thaw. The neighboring homesteaders were nowhere near as secure. Despite boasting pricey smokehouses and years of supposed expertise, plenty of them had allowed good meat to spoil. Mr. Garrett lost a solid 20 pounds of beef when one of his wooden sheds caught fire due to a blazing hot hearth. The McAllister clan had to throw out an entire slaughtered hog after blowflies laid eggs in the flesh before the smoke could fully seal it. These were incredibly steep blunders that Marta simply could not afford to make, which is precisely why she avoided them. The true grip of winter clamped down during the opening week of December. It did not ease in gradually. It slammed shut with the sudden violence of a heavy iron door. On the 6th day of December, the thermometer read a comfortable 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By the 7th of December, a foot of snow had dumped on the valley, and the temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees. Ice started creeping out from the muddy banks of the Pecos River. Local households scrambled frantically to hoard whatever supplies they could scrounge up. Firewood, above all else. The freezing season out in New Mexico might not match the sheer brutality of a Montana or Dakota blizzard, but it will kill a man just as dead if he catches himself unprepared. Thomas McAllister managed to sell off every single axe, handsaw, and coil of rope lining the shelves of his mercantile. Chopped timber suddenly became far more valuable than prime beef. William Garrett, backed by his sprawling estate and deep pockets, felt no real anxiety. The man possessed enough stacked cords to keep a fire roaring day and night for a solid 3 months. He was fully stocked with cured cuts, salted beef barrels, dry beans, and milled flour. His hired hands had erected sturdy new barns to shield the cattle herds. He was entirely ready, or so he assumed. The actual issue with the freeze of 1886 wasn't merely the bone-chilling cold. It was the relentless endurance of it. December proved brutal enough, but January felt downright apocalyptic. The snowfall simply would not quit, piling up into towering drifts reaching over 6 feet high. The thermometer dropped below zero, plunging all the way down to minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless northern gale howled endlessly, a bitter draft that hunted down every single crack, crevice, and structural flaw in the homesteaders' cabins. Tucked safely inside her modest mud brick dwelling, Marta kept a very conservative hearth burning. She burned strictly what was required to stay alive. Diego had figured out how to forage for dried buffalo chips out on the frozen plains, a reliable fuel source the native tribes had relied upon for generations. It smoldered at a slow, intense heat and didn't cost a single red cent. Her affluent neighbors turned their noses up at it, calling it sheer filth. Marta simply viewed it as practical wisdom. They chewed through their jerky rations at a measured pace, truly savoring every single bite. They would toss chunks of it into a pot of beans, brewing up hearty stews that stretched for several days. Fresh baked bread became a rare luxury they only enjoyed on Sabbath mornings, yet their bellies never once ached from starvation. They never felt the freezing chill settle deep into their bones. That cramped, unassuming adobe shack actually trapped the warmth far more effectively than the drafty timber mansions of the wealthy ranchers. And the cured provisions Marta had processed down in her dirt tunnel kept their bodies robust. Out at the Garrett estate, the situation painted a very different picture. His curing sheds sat completely empty now, with all his meat stockpiled away in cellar barrels. However, a major flaw soon emerged. Not a single soul had predicted the freeze would stretch on for this long. By the middle of January, Garrett was plowing through his cordwood at a truly terrifying speed. His ranch hands were out chopping timber in waist-deep powder, dragging heavy logs all the way back to the main house. It was savage, life-threatening labor. A pair of his workers suffered such severe frostbite on their fingers that the local physician in Santa Rosa had to surgically remove them. Over at the Hoffman residence, matters were even grimmer. That gorgeous cedar smokehouse of theirs had seemed to operate fine initially, but the cuts they had prepared simply weren't holding up the way they had banked on. Some crucial misstep had ruined the batch. Perhaps the drying cycle hadn't finished properly. Maybe too much moisture had been trapped inside. By the close of January, large sections of their hoarded meat had grown fuzzy with mold and had to be tossed to the hounds. The girl's father, that wealthy Albuquerque financier, had zero experience dealing with these brutal northern freezes. He had simply figured his bankroll could fix any hardship. But hard currency cannot purchase supplies that have ceased to exist. The McAllister brood, backed by the town mercantile, fared slightly better. Thomas had survived enough harsh seasons to understand the value of hoarding rations. Yet even the rugged Scotsman was beginning to sweat. Towering drifts had entirely choked off the trail leading to Las Vegas. Fresh deliveries were completely out of the question until the passes thawed out, and nobody could guess when that might happen. His shop shelves, usually packed to the brim, were starting to look awfully bare. Marta spent her daylight hours huddled indoors, tutoring her little ones in reading and writing. She owned exactly 3 hardcovers, a pair in Spanish and a single English volume, but they studied them endlessly. During the late afternoons, whenever the sun managed to peek through, Diego would bundle up and check his rabbit snares. He didn't always catch something, but whenever he struck luck, Marta would toss the fresh hare straight down into her dirt tunnel. The system worked flawlessly, even in the dead of the freeze. She would shovel a narrow trench through the snowdrifts to reach the hatch, spark up a tiny blaze using brittle twigs she had stashed back in autumn, and watch the vapor draft smoothly through the insulated underground channel. The biting winter air actually worked in her favor, keeping the meat perfectly chilled while the smoke performed its preservation magic. February crashed into the valley like a starving timber wolf. The blizzards refused to let up. The mercury gauge outside McAllister's store plunged to numbers the man had never witnessed in his life. 30 below zero. Then, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The Pecos River froze entirely solid, turning into a massive highway of thick ice. Wild predators began creeping right into the settlement, driven mad by sheer starvation. A mountain lion slaughtered 3 of Father Dunn's dairy goats. Timber wolves could be heard howling every single night. And then, on the 14th of February, 1887, the storm hit. An event the Valley elders would later dub the Devil's Week. A blizzard of such monstrous fury swept through that grown men lost their bearings just trying to walk from their porch to their own barn. The gale-force winds shrieked with enough power to rip wooden shingles straight off the rooftops. The thermometer bottomed out at a staggering 40 degrees below zero. William Garrett found himself in incredibly deep trouble. His massive cordwood reserve, which had looked practically endless back in December, was dwindling at a panic-inducing rate. His hired hands were tossing whole logs into the hearth just to keep the main parlor above freezing. The livestock barns were ice cold. 3 of his prized horses froze to death right in their stalls. The roaming cattle out on the plains had completely vanished beneath the powder, having perished right where they stood. On the bitterly dark evening of February 16th, one of Garrett's ranch hands hammered his fists against Marta's door. It was a Mexican fellow hailing from Chihuahua named Esteban, a decent soul who had consistently shown her kindness around town. He was absolutely caked in white powder and shivering uncontrollably.
"Mrs. Solís?"
He stammered through chattering teeth. "Mr. Garrett, the boss is terribly ill. He's running a vicious fever. We haven't tasted a scrap of decent meat in a fortnight. We've been surviving on nothing but stale crusts and dry beans. He sent me over, ordered me to ask if you might have any spare rations. He swears he'll pay whatever price you name." Marta didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. She stepped back into her warm cabin and reappeared holding 5 massive slabs of cured venison. "Take these," she instructed, "and make sure to inform Mr. Garrett that the moment he gets his strength back, he is more than welcome to come inspect my hole in the dirt, free of charge." Esteban stared back at her, his eyes welling up with heavy tears. "You are an absolute saint, ma'am. A true saint." A couple of days later, Thomas McAllister showed up accompanied by his boy, both mounted on horseback, fighting furiously against the driving wind. "Mrs. Solís," the shopkeeper bellowed from the yard, "we desperately need your help. The mercantile is completely wiped out. The townsfolk are starving. I know you've got provisions. I catch the scent every single time I ride past. I am begging you." Marta stepped out onto her porch, bundled tightly in her woven shawl. "How many mouths are we talking about, Mr. McAllister?" The Scotsman suddenly looked 2 decades older than he had back in autumn. 10 entire households, likely around 40 souls. The little ones are falling sick. "Please, ma'am." Marta ran the grim calculations in her head. She had hoarded enough jerky to keep herself and her children alive for another solid 2 months, potentially 3 if they stretched the portions. If she handed over 50% of her stash, she would be forced to hunt come springtime, right when the local game was at its skinniest. It was a massive gamble, but she suddenly recalled a piece of wisdom her granddad used to preach. "The rations hoarded purely for yourself are nothing but a heavy curse, little Marta. Food broken and shared among neighbors is a blessing that always finds its way back to you, doubled in size. Go fetch those families, Mr. McAllister, but understand I can only part with half of my stockpile. And in return for this meat, I expect every able-bodied man to help me dig out more curing trenches before the next freeze hits, so that not a single soul in this valley ever has to face starvation again." McAllister nodded with frantic relief. "You have my word. I swear to the Almighty, we have a bargain." That very evening, 10 distinct households across the Santa Rosa Valley supped on savory jerky pulled straight from Marta Solis's dirt tunnels. A few folks actually wept as they chewed, not merely because of the rich flavor, though it was spectacular, but because of the heavy truth it carried. A solitary widow, the exact same woman they had mercilessly shunned, was now pulling them back from the brink of death. The monstrous blizzard finally broke on the 22nd day of February. The sun pierced through an impossibly clear blue sky, glaring so intensely against the white powder that it physically hurt the eyes. The entire valley resembled a sprawling, frost-bitten graveyard. Frozen cattle carcasses littered the landscape, forming grim, dark lumps beneath the snowdrifts. Timber had been splintered. Heavy roofs had caved in under the weight. But the settlers, the human beings of the valley, had managed to pull through. William Garrett was among the very first to pay Marta a visit the moment he regained his footing. He arrived trudging through the snow on foot, stripped of his prideful black stallion. His features were gaunt and pale, his eye sockets deeply sunken. He stood directly across from her, remaining entirely silent for a long stretch of time. At long last, he spoke up. "Mrs. Solís, I am a complete fool, a stubbornly arrogant fool. You single-handedly saved my life. You spared my ranch hands. And I had the gall to mock you. I have absolutely zero excuses for my behavior." Marta felt bone-tired. She was far too exhausted to revel in any sort of petty victory. "Mr. Garrett, every last one of us acts the fool until this harsh life finally educates us. You have learned your lesson. That is plenty enough for me." The wealthy rancher shook his head. "It isn't nearly enough. I want to be educated in your curing methods. I am asking you to instruct me on how to dig out those underground chambers. Furthermore, I intend to compensate you for every single ounce of jerky you sent my way. The cost is absolutely no object." Marta offered a fatigued, gentle smile. "I have no desire for your cash, Mr. Garrett. What I require is your physical labor. Come next autumn, we are going to educate this entire settlement on how to endure without relying on pricey, fragile contraptions. We are going to teach these folks the wisdom of the ancestors. That is my only price." Garrett thrust his hand forward. "That is a mighty fair bargain, ma'am. The absolute fairest deal I've struck in my entire life." The spring thaw of 1887 showed up incredibly late, but it eventually broke through. The heavy drifts melted off at a crawl, swelling the riverbanks until the waters roared like an untamed beast. The earliest wildflowers, tiny yet fiercely resilient, punched their way up through the thick mud. Flocks of songbirds migrated back into the territory, and the Santa Rosa Valley finally began to mend its wounds. Something fundamental, however, had shifted. The local folks no longer viewed Marta Solís as that deranged Mexican widow who scratched at the dirt. She was now universally recognized as the savior of the settlement. Grown men tipped their brims in deep respect whenever she walked past. The town ladies constantly dropped by with fresh baked goods and garden vegetables to share. The neighborhood kids happily ran around with Diego and the girls, completely indifferent to the patched-up state of their clothing. During the autumn stretch of 1887, right before the upcoming freeze could set in, Marta made good on her vow. Backed by the muscle of William Garrett, Thomas McAllister, and roughly 24 local hands, she ran a masterclass on carving out subterranean curing tunnels. Every single household scooped out their own personal trench, adhering strictly to Marta's exacting guidelines. Hitting the precise depth, nailing the exact incline, packing the mud seal perfectly tight. They fully embraced the very same strategies that the native Pueblo tribes had perfected over centuries, the exact methods those white pioneers had previously scoffed at as uncivilized nonsense. That following winter, when the bitter chill rolled back into town, not a single belly went empty. Submerged tunnels all across the valley floor quietly drafted sweet smoke up through the snowbanks, each one serving as a miniature, foolproof survival factory. The entire settlement realized that innovation doesn't necessarily have to be brand new to prove highly effective. Every now and then, the most ancient ways are by far the wisest. Marta Solís remained on this earth until she reached the ripe age of 73. She lived to watch her kids mature, tie the knot, and raise youngsters of their own. Diego eventually found his calling as a schoolteacher. Little Luz wound up marrying Thomas McAllister's boy, beautifully bridging two distinct cultures that had once felt completely at odds. That cramped little mud brick cabin was eventually expanded into a proper, sprawling farmhouse. Yet Marta refused to ever backfill her original smoking trench. She preserved it as a solemn monument, and every single autumn, without fail, she would cure a fresh batch of jerky down in the dirt. That fragrant scent of burning mesquite became so deeply tied to her property that the locals affectionately dubbed the place the Land of Sweet Smoke. By the time she passed away in the year 1910, practically the entirety of northern New Mexico had adopted some localized variation of her earthen system. The massive cattle barons constructed highly complex models featuring interconnected draft shafts. The poorer homesteaders dug out bare-bones versions, utilizing whatever scraps they could forage. Yet every single design adhered to the exact same foundational logic. Harness the soil, show respect to the flames, maintain absolute patience, survive the freeze. During her burial service, William Garrett, now an elderly gentleman of 75, stood up to address the mourners. He delivered a eulogy that the valley folks carried with them to their graves. Marta Solís proved to us all that having a humble spirit does not equal weakness. She taught us that true intelligence doesn't sprout from pricey textbooks or fancy polished equipment. It stems from keeping your eyes open, listening closely, and possessing the sheer grit to execute plans that the rest of the world dismisses as pure lunacy. That woman spared my life. She rescued this entire county, and she accomplished the whole miracle by scooping out a hole in the mud using her own 2 bare hands. May the good Lord grant every last one of us a mere fraction of her bravery. The dirt-curing trenches pioneered by Marta, alongside the hundreds modeled after her blueprint, remained in heavy rotation across New Mexico straight through to the 1950s, right up until modern electrical refrigeration finally rendered them a thing of the past. But even to this day, tucked away in certain corners of northern New Mexico, up in those high ridges where the heritage families still operate much like their grandparents did, if you happen to hike across the pastures during the autumn chill and keep your eyes peeled, you just might spot tiny plumes of vapor drifting straight up out of the soil. Those are the final surviving earthen smokers, still actively drafting, still successfully performing the exact chore they've handled for generations. And should you wander close enough to inhale that fragrant vapor of burning mesquite or cottonwood, you can shut your eyes tight and practically envision a 32-year-old widow, broke and fiercely mocked by her peers, chipping away with a rusty spade beneath the punishing glare of the July sun. You can almost pick up the faint echo of her granddad whispering softly in her ear, "The soil is your greatest ally, little Marta. It will always shelter you, provided you treat it with respect." Historical accounts, like the saga of Marta Solís, serve as a stark reminder that a humble approach and a keen eye are worth infinitely more than solid gold. They remind us that the folks who walked this earth before us were certainly no fools. They had already cracked the code on struggles we still wrestle with today, yet they managed to conquer those hardships without fat bankrolls or lavish technology, relying entirely on sharp wits and grueling physical labor. If this tale of ultimate frontier justice resonated deeply with your soul, drop down into the comments and let us know which forgotten ancestral lessons we ought to drag back into the light. Furthermore, please share this video with anybody who truly needs a reminder that an alternative route exists, a path far humbler yet infinitely wiser, a journey that doesn't demand stacks of cash to succeed, merely requiring a willing pair of hands and an incredibly courageous heart.